For thousands of years, the names Sodom and Gomorrah have been associated with one of history's most famous stories of destruction. Two cities, a warning, and a catastrophe so complete that their names became symbols of a civilization erased from the earth. But there is a problem. We know the story. What we do not know is where the cities actually stood. Across the lands surrounding the Dead Sea, archaeologists have uncovered ancient cities, abandoned settlements, and destruction layers. Some have even been proposed as Sodom and Gomorrah, but none has been universally accepted. So if these cities really existed, where are they? And how much of their story can archaeology actually recover?
The story of Sodom begins long before modern archaeology. In the book of Genesis, Sodom is presented as a city on a fertile plain near the Dead Sea, alongside other settlements whose names have survived through ancient tradition. Its fate is described in dramatic terms. The cities are destroyed, and Sodom becomes a symbol of catastrophic judgment. But archaeology asks a different question. Not whether the story carries religious meaning, not whether the destruction was divine, but whether a real settlement in a real place can be identified behind the tradition. And that changes everything. Because finding an ancient city that was destroyed is not enough. To identify it as Sodom, archaeologists would need to establish that its location, chronology, and archaeological history actually fit the evidence. And that is where the mystery begins.
The search begins around the Dead Sea. This region has been inhabited for thousands of years, and its landscape contains some of the most important archaeological sites in the southern Levant. But the passage of time has made the search enormously difficult. Cities disappear. Buildings collapse. Settlements are abandoned. Landscapes change. And ancient names do not always survive long enough to tell archaeologists exactly where a city once stood. That means the search for Sodom cannot begin with a ruin and a name. It has to begin with clues. Where was the plain described by the ancient tradition? What settlements existed there? When were they inhabited? And most importantly, when were they destroyed? Answering those questions produced two very different directions in the search. One points south of the Dead Sea. The other points north. And the difference between them is at the heart of the debate.
South of the Dead Sea, archaeologists have investigated sites including Bab edh-Dhra and Numeira. These are not imaginary cities created to match the story. They are real archaeological sites with evidence of ancient occupation and destruction. Bab edh-Dhra in particular preserves substantial remains from the early Bronze Age, while Numeira also shows evidence of an ancient settlement that eventually came to an end. Because of their location and their destruction, some researchers have proposed that these sites could preserve the remains of the cities remembered in the biblical tradition. The idea is appealing. Two ancient settlements, a region associated with the Dead Sea, and evidence that both sites experienced destruction. But there is an immediate problem. An archaeological site can be real without being Sodom, and a destruction layer can be real without being the destruction described in Genesis. The crucial question is whether the dates actually match. And once chronology enters the argument, the apparent answer becomes much less certain.
Then another candidate entered the discussion, Tal el-Hammam, in the Jordan Valley northeast of the Dead Sea. The site is enormous compared with many nearby settlements, and excavations have revealed substantial remains from the Middle Bronze Age. Its excavators have argued that the site fits several features they associate with Sodom: its position, its size, its chronology, and the evidence for catastrophic destruction. But the northern proposal has also faced strong criticism.
Opponents argue that the geography described in the ancient text does not fit Tal el-Hammam. Others challenge the chronology, arguing that the date of the site's destruction is too late to fit their reconstruction of the patriarchal period. In other words, the debate is not simply about which ruin looks more impressive. It is about whether archaeology, geography, and chronology can all tell the same story. And right now, they do not.
Then came a claim that seemed to change the entire debate. In 2021, researchers published a study arguing that Tal el-Hammam had been destroyed by an enormous cosmic airburst. The proposed event was compared to the famous Tunguska explosion in Siberia. The researchers argued that the destruction could explain unusual damage found at the site, and the study suggested that such an event might also have inspired traditions resembling the destruction of Sodom. The claims spread quickly. Suddenly, one archaeological site appeared to have something that looked remarkably close to the biblical story. A city destroyed suddenly, extreme heat, devastation across the settlement, and a possible explanation that came from the sky. But there was a problem. The evidence behind the claim was challenged. Critics questioned the methodology, the interpretation of mineralogical and geochemical data, and the physical model used to explain the destruction. And eventually, the story changed again.
On April 24, 2025, Scientific Reports retracted the 2021 study. The journal stated that problems involving the methodology, mineralogical and geochemical analysis, and interpretation of the evidence meant that the conclusion that an airburst destroyed Tal el-Hammam could no longer be considered reliable. That does not prove that Tal el-Hammam was not destroyed catastrophically. It does not prove that Sodom never existed. And it certainly does not prove that the ancient story is false. What it does prove is something much more important for this investigation. A dramatic scientific explanation is not automatically strong historical evidence. The most spectacular interpretation can still fail when its underlying evidence is re-examined. And once the airburst theory is removed from the equation, we are left with the original problem. A real archaeological site, a real destruction layer, but no definitive proof that it was Sodom.
So what can actually be said? First, there is something we can say with confidence. The archaeological sites are real. Ancient settlements existed around the Dead Sea and the Jordan Valley, and some experienced destruction and abandonment. That is evidence. But identifying one of those settlements as Sodom is a different claim. The southern candidates have archaeological features that have been used to support the traditional southern location. But questions about chronology remain. Tal el-Hammam has substantial remains and a major destruction horizon, and its excavators have argued strongly for its identification with Sodom. But critics continue to dispute the geographical and chronological fit. And the airburst explanation that made the site internationally famous has now been retracted. So the possibilities have to be separated. An ancient city? Confirmed. A destruction event? Possible. Or at individual sites, archaeologically supported. Sodom? Possible. Sodom definitively identified? Not established. And that distinction may be the most important fact in the entire investigation.
So, did Sodom and Gomorrah really exist? The evidence does not allow us to give a simple yes or no. Archaeology has uncovered real ancient settlements in the Dead Sea region that have been proposed as possible candidates. But no site has achieved universal acceptance as the historical Sodom. And even when a site shows evidence of destruction, that does not automatically identify the event with the biblical account. The evidence is therefore strongest at the bottom of the chain. Ancient cities existed. Some were destroyed. The region described by the tradition was genuinely inhabited. But the final step remains unresolved. We cannot take a real ruin and simply declare that it is Sodom.
and we cannot take the absence of a definitive identification and declare that Sodom must have been invented. The historical verdict remains somewhere between those two extremes.
Perhaps that is what makes the mystery of Sodom so difficult to solve. The problem is not a lack of ruins, it is a lack of certainty. The Dead Sea region preserves traces of ancient societies that rose, flourished, and disappeared. Some were destroyed, some were abandoned, and somewhere within that landscape may be the historical memory that eventually became the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. But archaeology cannot simply turn a possibility into a fact. For now, the ruins can tell us that ancient destruction was real. They can tell us where people lived. They can sometimes tell us when those settlements disappeared. What they cannot yet tell us is whether any one of those ruins was the Sodom described in the ancient tradition. And perhaps the real mystery is not whether we have found Sodom. It is how much of the story history can still recover.